So welcome everyone to NE Bytes for May 2022. Usual announcements if no one's been with us before. Our events page is hosted by Tito, ti.to NE Bytes. There's our Twitter handle and email. Link for our code of conduct and any suggestions, comments, anything like that, to either to me or to Brett. So on to tonight. We've got two speakers with us this evening. Peter's going to be speaking to us first about Uno platform, not the Uno card game. And then Dylan Hayes is going to take us to a very, very dark place. So first of all, I'll hand over to Peter and we'll kick off with Uno Pomodoro. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Just make sure I'm sharing correctly. Great. So hopefully you can see the slides. Right. Excellent. Thank you. Get everything in a row. Right. Hello. So I'm Peter Bull, and this is my talk, Uno Pomodoro, and it's about the Uno platform and the Pomodoro technique. So talking of which, I'll switch over to a application. I can. Will let me. Windows is being funny again. Oh well.
We can see the timer.
Excellent. Right. So what we can see there is the Pomodoro application there. So I'll just get that timer started, and then I'll get on with the slides. I'll just have to minimize this. So I can't actually see the timer on my screen. But anyway, on with the show. So can you see the slides again?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Sorry about that. Okay. So about me. So I'm a senior or web platform developer using C# and ASP.NET MVC, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. But personally, I've worked with .NET for over 2 decades, and in the first half using VB.NET, and then I switched to C# for the most recent half of that. I've got some open source libraries on my GitHub, so I've got a couple of Spotify libraries, and I've got a few more examples as well on my GitHub at github.com/roleplanetoid, so you can check out all the other stuff I've been working on. You can also find me on Twitter at roleplanetoid, so feel free to follow me there if you want. And all my latest stuff, so I've been creating some like tutorials, talks, and workshops of my own, and they're on at tutorialart.com. Oh, first of all, what is the Uno platform? Well, the Uno platform, that allows you to basically create multi-platform applications using C# and WinUI using XAML, all with one platform. You can also target the latest major operating systems and web browsers. You can maintain pixel-perfect control with platform-specific code or a custom look and feel. You can use the familiarity and richness of C# and XAML in your preferred IDE. And you can also learn more about Uno at platform.uno, so you can get some examples and documentation and stuff there. Oh, targets. You can target a few platforms with Uno platform itself. So you can target Windows 10 or 11, and you can use WinUI. On modern browsers, that's Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. And you can use, that'll use HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, and WebAssembly. You can also target macOS and iOS, and that'll use AppKit and UIKit. And you can target Android using Views. And finally, you can target Linux or even Tizen with Skier. And with Skier, with WPF, you can actually target Windows 7 if you want to. So the Uno platform architecture itself is based on .NET. So Xamarin's used at the moment. That's used on macOS, iOS, and Android, but you can also use .NET 6 across all the platforms as well. And the platform code itself is C# and XAML. WinUI is used on Windows, and that runs directly against the Windows API. And that'll deliver a modern desktop application style with consistent styles and controls with the rest of Windows, so your applications will look seamless running on Windows 10 or Windows 11. But Uno platform itself, that allows you to extend the reach of WinUI. So you can still use WinUI, but you can target web browsers, like I mentioned, macOS, iOS, Android, and Linux, and even Windows 7 if you wanted to. So Uno platform has some ways you can try it out. So there's the Uno Playground. That's where you can experiment with the platform. You just can load that up in your browser. You can try out a few XAML-based controls, or you can, if you've got any XAML you want to try it out, see how it looks, you can paste it in, and you can try that on desktop and mobile as well. But on the web, if you just go to playground.platform.uno, you can try it out. The next place you can go is the Uno Gallery. So that's basically a collection of like ready-to-use controls that'll help you speed up development, and you can check them out and see how they'll look in this gallery. So you can go through all the different controls, and there's a light and dark theme as well, so you can see them either way around. And you can check that out on desktop. You can install that on your desktop machine. There's a mobile app as well, and you can get it on the web at gallery.platform.uno. So Uno platform also provides application templates. There's an uno.extensions NuGet package that allow you to quickly set up your Uno platform application. And there's key features such as dependency injection can help out with, some configuration ones, HTTP. There's some logging helpers as well. There's also helpers for serialization, environment helpers, localization, and hosting as well. Uno platform also licenses a multi-platform first UI component. That's free if you're an individual developer, or you're making less than $1 million in revenue if you're a business. And there's controls such as a tab bar that allows you to create tab-based navigation. The navigation bar allows you to create navigation logic such as the back button. There's also an auto layout control, so it allows you to have dynamic layouts that handle different screen sizes. And there's a draw control as well, so you can have quick access destinations in your application or any functionality you want to expose, and you can either pull down on an icon to display that, or you can pin it on the screen. Uno platform for Figma. So this is a Figma plugin that's currently in preview that allows you to create pixel perfect layouts for Uno platform applications inside Figma. You'll be able to go from high fidelity Figma designs to developer friendly extendable XAML code. And you can use the Uno toolkit material components that allow you to design your application, and you can easily modify them so you can change different color schemes and stuff to fit with your corporate branding, things like that. And you can experience your application before you even start coding, and you can even use mock data to see how that would behave. And developers still retain control over their code, but designers can also agree and maintain any designs to keep things in check, so you get a good developer-designer workflow. So if you want to develop with the Uno platform, if you want to do that on Windows, you've got a few choices. So if you want to do that with Visual Studio 2022, you can do that, and you can develop for Windows 10 and 11 with UWP and WinUI. You can target the web with WebAssembly, and you can target macOS, iOS, and Android with Xamarin. And you can target macOS, Linux, and Windows 7, as mentioned before, with Skier. If you prefer to use Visual Studio Code, you can still use that, but you can target WebAssembly, or you can target for macOS, Linux, and Windows 7 with Skier. If JetBrains Rider is your IDE of choice, you can target Windows 10, 11 with UWP and WinUI, the web with WebAssembly, iOS and Android with Xamarin, plus macOS, Linux, and Windows 7 with Skier. If you're on a Mac and you want to develop for Uno platform there, you can. You've got, again, a few choices. You can use Visual Studio for Mac, and that allows you to target macOS, iOS, Android with Xamarin, and you can also target macOS and Linux with Skier. You can use Visual Studio for Code on a Mac, and you can target the web with WebAssembly or macOS and Linux with Skier. And if you're using JetBrains Rider on a Mac, you can target WebAssembly for the web, macOS, iOS, and Android with Xamarin, or macOS and Linux with Skier. And you can even develop on Linux if you want. So you can use Visual Studio Code, and again, you can target the web with WebAssembly or macOS and Linux with Skier. And if you're using JetBrains Rider on Linux, you can again target WebAssembly with the web, macOS, iOS, and Android with Xamarin, or you can target macOS and Linux with Skier. So whichever your preferred IDE, if you're in VS Code, you can pretty much go through the whole three. Or if you're using Rider, you can use that on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So good choices if those are your favorite IDEs. So if you want to get set up on Windows for Visual Studio, you just basically either need to install Visual Studio if you've not got it already, or modify the installation for Visual Studio 2022, for example. And you basically need to just select the following workflows to get yourself set up. So the first one's the Universal Windows Platform Development Workflow. That's for the desktop applications. Then there's the mobile development with .NET Workflow. That allows you to do that's to support the Xamarin-based ones and the mobile applications. And the ASP.NET Web Development Workflow that allows the WebAssembly stuff to work. And once you've got all of those workflows installed, you then just need to get the Uno Platform Solution template from Extension, and you get that from the Visual Studio Marketplace. But if you do need to target iOS and macOS, you do need a Mac for that. And then once you've got yourself set up, you can get yourself started. So you can check your installation is fully complete with there's a command line utility called Uno Check. So you can run that, and that will tell you that everything is set up fine. Once that's set up, you can just start Visual Studio 2022 if that's your IDE of choice. Then you can, from Get Started, just choose Create New Project, just like you would normally. If you've installed those templates, you should see them. So you can choose the multi-platform app project template. This is the Xamarin one, but there's also a .NET 6 one. Then once done, just set the project name and location as you would do normally. And then you create the solution. So in the solution will be various projects for the different platforms. There'll be an Android one, iOS, macOS, and then there's a Skier one with GTK. There's a Skier one with WPF, and there's a Skier one with Tizen. And then there's a WebAssembly project for the WASM one for the browser one. And then there's the Windows project, of course. And then finally, there's a shared project that where you put your code and stuff for your actual application, and that's shared throughout all the applications. So that was the Uno platform. So what's the Pomodoro technique? So Pomodoro is basically just the Italian for tomato. So the Pomodoro technique is basically a time management technique, and it was developed by Francesco Cirillo. I'm not sure if that's pronouncing your name right. Sorry if that's wrong, but he developed this in the late 1980s, and that basically uses a timer to break work into intervals. And he basically just used a tomato timer to define that, hence why it's a tomato. So basically, what you do is you just you basically set a timer for your task. So usually that's about 25 minutes for the task that you're going to be doing, which you briefly saw at the beginning of the talk. And then once the timer has elapsed, you just basically take a 5 to 10 minute break. Then once you've done that, you basically set the timer again, you work for another 25 minutes, and then you take another short break, and you just keep doing that. And that work break cycle, that's known as a Pomodoro. So that's what you're trying to complete. And after 4 of those are done, you basically you take a longer break. So that's between usually about 20 to 30 minutes. And then if your task isn't completed by then, you do it again. So you just keep repeating this cycle of doing these Pomodoros, as they call them, and then taking a short break and so on and so forth till your task is finished. And this is usually a good way of sort of managing your time and making sure you're getting those tasks done, but also taking breaks in between. Let's take a look at our demo. So I'll just end my presentation here. So hopefully you should be able to see my Visual Studio here, but also show the application. I wasn't able to start running at the start, so I'll just start it here. So basically what this timer is doing is just counting down the 25 minutes that would form a Pomodoro. So I could work away and do my task, and then once the timer is complete, it would give me a notification telling me that I've finished my task. So what I'll do is I will stop that one from running. Okay, and I'll switch to the WebAssembly one. So basically, as I mentioned, you can target multiple platforms. That particular one was the Windows one, so we'll launch the WebAssembly one. So here it is. So it's the same application, exactly the same code running in a browser. So as you can see here, we've got the timer again. I can start it going again. It's a different timer. I can reset it. We've got different timers. So the short break I mentioned in the Pomodoro Technique, that's the 5-10 minute ones. I've set this one to 5 minutes. So you can again set that timer going, or you can go and take a long break. So when you've finished your 4 Pomodoros, that's what you're supposed to do. But I can start the 5-minute one going. So let's take a look at the code about how that works. So for this is nice and big and you can read it. Right. So I've just got an enum just to represent my different timers. So I've got my task timer, that's the tomato one, of course. Then we've got our short break, that's represented with our hot beverage, cup of tea basically. And we've got our long break, which is the green apple. So I've got the enum values set as the duration. So we've got 25, 5, and 20. So we could change those easily enough if we needed to. Then we've got a helper class here. I'm just implementing data binding here. So it's just a class to help with that, just to do the relevant events so the UI gets updated correctly. I'm using the command pattern. So when I switch between the different kinds of timers, I'm triggering commands. There's no button click events or anything like that in here. It's all done with commanding. So this is just a class to help with that, pretty standard. So this class here, this is basically for each timer item itself. So this represents like the Pomodoro type, if you like. So we've got the actual enum, and then we've got these color values. So the upper and lower portions of the UI I define in here. We also have a unique identifier, so we can identify that for certain purposes that I can use in the app. The time span itself, how long the time is for, basically. So I'm just converting the enum to a time span, minutes. So that's the reason why I've got that as that number, so I can do that easily. I've got this, which just helps get the resource names. So there's basically different images for each resource that you can see them here. So you can see there's the green apple one. Hopefully you can see that hovering over. And there's different graphics for each type of, for each one that you saw. And then we just got a toString that allows me to get the name of the actual timer if I need it. Then we've got this alert class. So what will happen when the timer is elapsed is that will trigger a alert. So it will tell me when did I start that timer and when did I finish, along with the type of Pomodoro it is. And then we've just got our event arguments, which will just trigger as part of the event. And then we've got a notification. This allows us to pass in a notification. So certain platforms, we might want to hook into the platform-wide notification system. So this allows us to do that if that platform has that support. So here's the actual timer class itself. So we've got the 3 different types you can see here. So we've got a list of timers. We've got some property, some members here just to define a few different things like when it started and stuff. We've got some events. So when I'm adding a timer, it's going to trigger the add event. So when I click start on a timer, basically, if I remove a timer, so that's when I click it again, it'll remove it. And when the timer's elapsed, I get a triggered event, so I can hook into that. Then we just got the properties display. That's the countdown that you see. The item, that's the upper and lower portion, and the graph, and allows the graphic to display that you see. And just a couple of helper methods to update the UI. So we've just got a simple method that gets triggered every tick of a timer, and that will update the UI. So we actually see the timer ticking down And if the timer is elapsed, we fire our triggered event that we can hook into. And here's when I start the timer. So if an alert has been pre-configured, so say I can actually set one that's been preloaded, and then I can, but if not, this will create a new one that will start immediately, and it will also fire an event. So if you want to have anything that wants to listen for when someone's adding a timer, you can do that. Or, and again, it just sets that and sets the timer going, and it runs every quarter of a second to update the UI just to show the timer itself. And then when I stop the timer, I just fire another event, the one I showed before, which is just when the timer has been removed. So if anything is like hooked into that, so if you're removing the timer, you need to remove it from whatever else you might be hooking into, that you can do that. And then we just have our constructor, and we're passing in a notification, that notification class. If it's present, it will use that notification to figure out which kind of timer it was, and we'll set the timer going to pick up a previously run timer. I'll show that in a bit. Or if there's not, it'll just start the timer just like I showed you. And you can toggle the timer on and off. This is just a converter. So when we're doing data binding, you can use converters. This is the same in basically. This is something you do in WinUI or UWP or WPF if you're familiar. So you can basically have converters that will convert one type into another. So this will convert an item type, which is my class, into the bitmap image that you actually see. So that's the apple and the tomato, of course. So here's my main class for the actual application. So I've got my dialog here. So that's what will actually be displayed when the timer has expired. And I've also got a helper method for my resource, because I'll actually show in some of the environments you can actually show more information on the actual message. So we'll be able to show that when the time has expired. And this method just shows that. So it's just a stack panel with a text box in it. I'll show you that the string familiar about when it started and finished. And we've got an image here, just as we're just using a small image here to display on the message. Then it's just some stuff when you're switching between timers just to handle that. And I've just got this, which when it's triggered, it'll trigger that event. And we have this, which just sets our command bar. So basically the command bar along the bottom, I just use this method to set it up. Finally, we've got just our constructor. So here I'm passing in a notification. So if there's an external source for one, I can pass it in. And then the loaded event is just configuring the UI and getting everything set up nicely. So I'll show the actual code. So this is the code for the application. So here I've got a preprocessor directive. So in a lot of C#, you might be familiar, you can basically set preprocess directives. So Uno platforms obviously supports this too. So we can use the specific directives for a specific target. So in this case, NetFX core is the UWP one. So in this region, this will only be built and run on Windows. So what this does is this hooks into the system-wide notification system. So I can basically hook into this notifier, get a pre-existing scheduled task, and then I can create this notification class from that. So I get the ID and when it should have finished. And then I pass that into my constructor. So if there's already a timer started, it will pick that up and it will allow you to display that one. Then when you're adding one, I again create a notification and I'll add that to the system-wide notification system. So it's just a toast notification that you can do in Windows. And I just set the text and the values to some values so you can see that when the notification gets fired. And if I remove the timer, obviously I want to remove the notification because I don't want that one to fire if I change my mind. So I just clean it up and I'm hooking into that event. And then the UI is pretty simple. It's just a simple grid with the upper and lower portions here. So I've got the upper one there. That's actually using that converter to display the apple or the tomato or the cup. And we've got the lower one and our text for the display. If I switch over to the web browser, luckily it's took me about that much time to show that, so that's perfect. So as you can see, the timer is completed, and I got a notification here. So it's just a message box here. It says it completed, the type of timer, when I started it, when I finished it, and it's got the little icon as well. And if I started one of the timers, it would be that icon instead. I can just click OK, and I could start a new timer and keep, start that going and get my task going. So I'll just stop that one. switch back to the UWP one. So if I run that one, just put it over here. So you see the timer's counting down already because this is the counter I started just before that. I started showing you the demo. So this will keep counting down. Once it reaches 0, not only will it show the message box with the tomato in it, it'll also show a system-wide notification. Obviously, we might not have time to see that, but if you went to the notification area where you see your notifications in Windows, you would see that notification appear there. So I'm able to hook into that notification. So yeah, that's basically the application. So I'll just get my slides back up. So as you saw, it was basically demoed a Pomodoro app. So it allows you to basically implement the Pomodoro technique. And it supports the 3 different kinds of timers. So we saw the task one itself, that's the tomato basically. Then we've got the short one, which was the cup or the hot beverage as they call it, and then it's the green apple. And those particular graphics I got from openmoji.org. So if you want to see more emoji graphics, they've got a great collection of emoji graphics that you can use open source in your projects, which are quite good. But not only can you run the application on Windows in the browser like I showed, but you can also run it on Android as well. I can't demo it in the emulator here, but I can show you some screenshots. So we've got this particular one, which is the task itself with the tomato, of course. Then we've got the short timer with the teacup, and we've got the long break one with the apple. So very similar looking. The application is like much taller to accommodate the screen on a mobile. So you've got a simple, nice, responsive design. And if say you wanted to hook into Android system-wide notifications, if that's supported, you could do that. I'm not 100% sure it is, but basically, if as Uno platform is growing, it's going to be adding more support for notifications. I know there's in the web browser they want to hook into the notification system there. That's definitely something that might be coming in the future. So you could have the system-wide notifications potentially be triggered, depending on how that's going to be supported. So, in summary, you can basically create multi-platform applications using C# and WinUI with XAML on the Uno platform. You can target any of the major operating systems, such as Windows 10, 11, macOS, iOS, Android, Linux, Tizen, and Windows 7. Or you can target browsers such as Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Or you can use like Uno extensions to quickly set up and expand your Uno platform application, or you can use multi-platform first components with the UI Uno.toolkit, or you can even use the Figma plugin to create designs in Figma to generate developer-friendly XAML. You can get set up and started pretty easily with Uno platform on Windows, Mac, or Linux. Just basically build wherever you need to, and you can use things like Visual Studio 2022, Visual Studio for Mac, Visual Studio Code, or JetBrains Rider, like I mentioned, any IDE you're comfortable in. And it also mentioned the Pomodoro Technique, and that helps you manage your tasks, and you can have short breaks in between. And of course, demoed the app that demonstrates the Pomodoro Technique. So that's it. Thanks again for listening. You can find any of the links to the resources that I use and code for this demo as well. And one thing that might have been fun to spot is how many tomatoes were in just the slides of this presentation. If you know how many it was, it's either 4, 6, 8, or 10. So there's no prize for getting it right, but if you do guess it, that'd be cool. But yeah, any questions?
No questions?
Not even a guess. On the tomato meter. There was a lot of them.
I say 8.
Yeah, that's it. Very good. Did you spot the small ones? That's probably what it was. I was hoping somebody missed those ones, but yeah.
I think I did, and then I approximated because I figured that we were supposed to see more than we saw.
Yes, they were hidden in the NE Bytes logo. If anyone else missed them, there was two where the blue circles are in one of the previous slides. So very good for you.
Hi Peter, what's the licensing model for this? How does it work, and generally, what are the sort of expenses you're going to be incurring using the platform?
So the platform's free, so it's fully open source. The only thing that you need to license is that toolkit, that UI toolkit, and even then, if you're making less than $1 million a year, you're good. So, and if you're an individual developer, it is free. So there's no cost with using the platform other than that toolkit, and it's entirely optional. You don't have to use that at all. You can build your own custom stuff. All the stuff I showed today didn't use that toolkit at all. So yeah, it's completely free to use.
Right. And what's deployment like? Is it just the usual, you end up with assemblies in a directory that you can deploy however you choose? There's no dependency. Is there dependencies on having to install anything else, or is it self-supporting?
You get everything. The workloads are what you basically need, but the Uno check thing I mentioned, that basically will install anything you're missing. So if you go through all those steps and then you run that, it's something you can download and install. And if you go to like platform.uno and look for the setup instructions, you can run that. So if you have any problems running it, you just run that. It'll check to see if you've got all the prerequisites correct, and it'll install whatever's missing, and then it's fine. Once you run that, it'll install everything you need if it wasn't installed already.
Okay, thanks a lot.
No problem.
I got one. What would you say is the killer advantage to this as a platform compared to the many competing solutions and platforms? Why would you choose Uno over any of the other ways we've done things before?
That's a good question. Yeah, because I mean, you've got quite a lot of platforms vying for this one platform sort of idea. You've got obviously Maui, which is replacing Xamarin, and that's targeting. But a lot of them miss the web out. So like the WebAssembly support is one where they'll cover like iOS and Android. Most of the other ones like Maui and like Avalonia, I think is another one. But for WebAssembly support, that's sometimes often not quite there as much as it is. But for Uno, it's pretty easy to get started. It's been around for a while as well, so it's pretty well supported. It's used in a lot of lot of companies are already using it. There's plenty of examples out there. So I mean, things like Maui aren't actually out properly yet, but Xamarin's been around for a while. But this has the Xamarin support, but it's using the sort of WinUI to target that. But yeah, it's a lot easier to get going. And if you have any trouble installing anything, you've got that Uno check utility. So it's relatively straightforward to get it started. And it's also moving on. The .NET 6 stuff is getting more and more baked in. I didn't show it today, but it's the platform is getting newer as time is going on. So it's not using Zap, like it's not falling behind. It's always keeping up to date. So yeah, I think the main benefit of Uno is just that wide support. There's plenty of examples out there, and something like this was a UWP app that I wrote a couple of years back, and I was able to convert it really easily. I didn't really have to I just made improvements, but otherwise it was exactly the same. So if you've got an existing UWP app or something like that, it's really easy to get it running on platform. So yeah, it's that flexibility and ease of use is a real advantage.
Yeah, I suppose the counter argument is that a mobile app is a fundamentally different thing to a Windows app. So there's not that many scenarios where you want one app in all places, because the way you'd optimize a Windows user interface is slightly different to a mobile. But then that's what we said 5 years ago. Nowadays, I think people expect mobile first. So maybe it's an advantage now.
Yeah, especially with that responsiveness. I know there's in the extensions and the toolkit, you've got that sort of responsiveness built in. So having a responsive app is a good thing on Windows anyway. If someone wants to shrink that your window right down, they're kind of going to get a mobile type experience. When I did like Windows 10 mobile, you were having to design apps that could scale from Windows 10 mobile to Windows 10 desktop. So it's kind of bringing that idea back in that we should be designing apps that are flexible for any size. And then the fact it's running on mobile is almost just a side benefit of that way of designing apps. So yeah, just having sort of a responsive app like you would do a responsive website is something that Uno allows you to do really easily. So you're designing for any size effectively.
Yeah, if the responsive story is good, it's potentially an advantage when you've got tablets and mobiles. I mean, the difference in screen size and resolution between mobile devices now is vast, isn't it? And it's really difficult to get a UI design that looks good on a tablet and on a phone.
Yeah, it is, and that's what the benefit the toolkit and the Figma stuff is just in preview at the moment. But that you can create a really, really nice mobile UI, and then have that running on all of the platforms, not just mobile. So you can basically keep that design really rich, have that full designer experience, still have the developer story. But yeah, that's the direction Uno's doing. It's not just getting stuff to work, it's getting stuff to look good, and that is another advantage it has. It's really the designer side of it's really starting to come in strong now. So you're getting that really well designed app that runs everywhere, which is something that Uno's really focusing on at the moment.
Have we got any more questions? No, doesn't seem like it. All right, excellent. Thank you very much, Peter, for that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for everyone. Good questions as well. Thank you.
So now we're moving on to our second talk of the evening with another long-time speaker and friend of NE Bytes, Dylan Hayes, who's going to take us to a frightening, terrible, awful place.
Okay. How long have we got at the moment? I don't know what we said as a finish time here. We're about 8 o'clock. I think we're good too, aren't we?
Something like that. We whatever time you want. There's no rush really.
Yeah. No train to catch home back like in the good old days. I was thinking I had to turn into a pumpkin because at 9:20 the train that took me back to Leeds and Wakefield departed from Central Station. So I could pretend that and just run out if you want. So anyway, I'll kick it off now, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, we've got a small audience and we've got tons of time. So if you want to interrupt me with a question or even challenge some, call me bullshit or whatever, then please do, because I very much encourage a very interactive style of presentation. Now, unfortunately, I can't actually do a demo of anything here. So I'm just going to have to rely on a bit audience interaction, the old fashioned way where you raise your hand and challenge me rather than fiddling around with techno toys. So if I just stick my slideshow on the screen, we can get this thing going. So let me just sort my windows out. I like to have the notion of looking at Teams when I'm talking. I'm going to talk to you about how I came to find myself in sales and why sales matters more than you think, and a little bit about how sales works and why it's important to everybody. So let me just tell you a little bit about me before we start. So if I just move along now. Oops, damn you Windows. So I am currently employed as a Microsoft 365 consultant. Now, consultancy in this particular case covers a multitude of sins, where essentially I've gone over to the dark and the commercial side. And although I do actually, effectively, I'm a salesperson that does his own pre-sales as well. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm relatively active on LinkedIn and Twitter. There's a QR code there if you can't be bothered to type. So let's just start with a story. I'm very fond of illustrating things with stories. So I want to tell you about a job interview that I did and how my failure in a job interview taught me some lessons. So anyway, I went to a job interview. It was a place I really wanted to work. and the interview was going really, really well. All the vibes were good. I really felt confident. I felt that the questions from HR I could deal with, the technical questions I could deal with easily. The interview was flowing along nicely. It felt a really, really good experience. And I was thinking, oh, this is fantastic. The job is mine. Anyway, so as you do in these circumstances, I immediately phoned the recruiter afterwards, and it was the usual, how did it go? And it's like, yeah, I think that was really good, really promising, good feel, good vibes from everything like that. So I left it at that. Anyway, next day I didn't hear anything. Day after that, I didn't hear anything. You're thinking, okay, this is a bit strange. So spoke to the headhunter, and he said, well, the HR person liked you, but the technical director, he didn't like you at all. He says you were way too salesy for him, and that's a no. That's a complete no. So at that point, I was quite disappointed at the time because I didn't get that job. As it happened, it was in a sector that got absolutely pooped on by COVID, so there may have been a fortuitous coincidence. But I remember walking away from that thinking, hang on, I'm a developer, and I basically failed to get a job because I came across too well. If that's what they meant by salesy, I was too proficient, too smooth, too slick. So I was thinking, hang on, if this is regarded as a problem, maybe I'm doing it all wrong. Maybe I'm doing the wrong job. So that thought stuck in my mind for a while. I didn't act on it right away, but that was always this seed that was there in my mind. So let's move along a little bit now. So I'll tell you a little bit about my journey of how I got to here. I did a degree in geology. I worked in the oil industry, as people who did degrees in geology often did, and I visited far off and exotic lands and Windsor. I wrote a reporting system when I was in the field. So that word of the reporting system and how popular it was eventually got back to HQ in Houston, and they basically decided to pull me in from being a citizen developer, as the expression now says, but at the time there was no such word, citizen developer. So they thought they would bring me back to HQ in Houston because it was basically making the developers look silly that somebody had written a reporting system in the field. So effectively I became a pro developer at that point, and I lived in Houston for some years. I came back to London when the oil industry had one of its downturns, its periodic downturns, and I've been working as a developer, I would say ever since, but for quite some time after that. And gradually I found myself morphing into more of a consultant. And then in the last 2 years, I've effectively crossed over. My journey to the dark side has become complete, as to paraphrase Darth Vader. And I've become much more sales focused. And although I could still read code, looking at the stuff, I was thinking, wow, I can still read a little bit of code. I haven't wrote any. The closest I've got to coding in the last 3 years has been a little bit of flows and power apps, which is dev light at the very, very least. But I could actually read some code. I've chosen not to write any. So as a developer, I believe certain stereotypes about salespeople, as we all do. Shallow, fast talking, never interested in detail, no desire to learn the technology they sold. Now I've fully morphed into the dark side. I find myself exposed to a similar bias about developers. So the biases about developers that salespeople often have, and put your hands up if you think you own these things or you disagree violently. Intense, overthinkers, poor social skills, and detail obsessed, and no desire or even care about the commercial world that effectively pays their salaries. So that's what salespeople think of developers. That's what developers think about salespeople. There's quite a gulf of understanding there. And I found myself having been both. I can see the stereotypes, and I can also see how they're wrong. And I probably are committing some of the sins. As a salesperson, I'm probably committing some of the sins that developers always accuse people of doing that. So it's been quite interesting because coincidental, at the same time that I've moved across to sales, we had a global pandemic. And it was an interesting one because basically I hadn't got a clue how sales worked. The thing is, nobody else at that time in March 2020, nobody else had a clue how to sell in a global pandemic as well. So suddenly the fact I didn't know anything about how sales worked was actually a huge advantage, because if you think you knew how it worked and suddenly the whole world was turned upside down, it's actually an advantage because you have to start from scratch and try and work out from first principles how things worked. Whereas before, you might have had 20 years of experience, but the 20 years of experience of, for example, cold calling people, arranging meetings, driving out up and down the motorway, all that sort of thing, sort of thing suddenly stopped working. So suddenly my lack of experience in that time and my technical background was actually a huge advantage, because when the world was reset, you were more able to jump out of the gate when things happened. So any questions so far? Okay, let's move on a bit. So I would say that small details matter. There is a very, very famous poem, euphemism, whatever you call it, about for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. You've probably seen the rest. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the battle was lost. For failure of the battle, the kingdom was lost. And for want of a horseshoe nail. So what that illustrates, that was written by Benjamin Franklin, I believe, but lots of other people claim the quote. The idea that a small detail in a project can sink a project and it can have far-reaching consequences. And I'd rather see that the sales process is like that, that if you make a mistake in the early parts of the process, the entire project can be doomed before any developer's ever written a line of code, that the whole project is effectively doomed because somebody failed to notice a significant detail. Now, in the world, as I find it in where my company works, we have shifted from a world where it was very much bespoke applications to now it's more about platforms. You write stuff that sits on top of SharePoint, Microsoft 365, Dynamics, etc. like that. So in a world of platforms, this becomes even more true, because in the world of bespoke development, you could pretty much do anything. But when you're constrained by the limitations of a platform, getting the details right at the start makes a big difference, because if the salesperson simply promises something's dead easy and it's just not, the whole project is going to struggle from that point of view. So the estimates are going to be off because you've basically promised something that isn't easy to deliver, and the project's going to struggle to be delivered on time, to meet client satisfaction, and to ultimately be profitable. So let's have a think about bad procurement. I would like to show you an example of what happens when you get procurement badly wrong. This is what happens when you get badly wrong in your procurement. So I would say the Russian military is a fantastic example of what happens when you get procurement badly wrong. When you have flagships that cost less than super yachts, when you have million-dollar missile launchers stuck in the mud as somebody pocketed the money for decent tires, when you're welding cages on top of tanks to protect you from missiles, I would say somewhere along the line, your procurement sales process has failed, because the Russian military was patently ill-equipped for the job that they found themselves doing. And quite a lot of that, there were lots of reasons for their failure, but one of the reasons is their procurement process is extremely corrupt and procures things that are ill-suited for the task they want. So you could say that Russian military procurement is a good example of why sales matters, because somewhere along the line, somebody really messed up in selling in their own sales process of giving them the right kit to do their job. And it acted as a further multiplier to their woes. Obviously, their woes are not limited to that, but that's one of the examples of how procurement actually matters. So I would say that sort of thing never could happen here, right? Our procurement processes are all scrupulous, perfect, and we never make any mistakes. And any project that the government procures and in the private sector always goes swimmingly. Well, no. Government IT projects are quite infamous for failures. Obviously, not all fail. Many of them are successes, but when they fail, it tends to make the news. Sometimes a small problem in procurement can actually have severe consequences. A friend of mine served in the Royal Navy, and he was an observer, which is a navigator on a helicopter. And he told me that basically because of a bad procurement, there was a switch on a radar they used to avoid flying into cliffs when they're flying at low level, and had a switch that basically switched off the part that would show you cliffs and it would show you other things. And this switch was designed in such a way that the switch would remain stuck on rather than being a switch you'd momentarily press to remove the clutter. So what they did is they had to fix this in training, where they would train the observers to use the switch correctly, rather than have a switch which just momentarily blanked out certain things and by default showed you a radar picture of what was around you so you didn't fly into an obstacle. Now, interestingly enough, he said it would have cost them about 10 grand to fix the problem, but they didn't fix the problem. Instead, they spent a lot of time, a lot more money than that, trying to train people not to make that mistake, because they were replacing that helicopter, which in reality turned out to be 10 years late. So they must have spent more than that on continuing to train people. And all of these little details, because basically they couldn't run an effective procurement process just to buy a simple switch, which probably cost about 50p, a simple switch that behaved in the right manner to stop people flying helicopters and side the hill. They spent tens of thousands easily on that, on training people to avoid that, and they still had that problem because somebody did fly into a mountain because of it. So that is an example of how an inflexible procurement regime can produce a unsatisfactory solution. And the sums of money aren't that colossal, but the problem is that nobody had confidence that they could run an effective procurement exercise to get beyond that. So let's start drilling into things a bit more. So what's this got to do with sales? So is the sales process part of the problem, or is it part of the solution? Well, I would actually argue that salespeople can help that process, because as a salesperson, you're vigorous, you're engaged in this Darwinian struggle along with other people to try and produce the best solution. So hopefully the buyer, be it a government or anybody, gets to choose between the widest possible selection of different possible ways of solving a problem by people who are vying to produce the best possible solution. In a more closed market where there's a monopoly or something like that, they're simply not going to have the choice. So a good salesperson can help pitch their company's products or services, and they're hopefully going against equally good salespeople who are pitching that. So hopefully, as a buyer, you get to choose between the best possible options rather than having a limited selection of rubbish. So I would say everything is sales. Every project, everybody's involved in selling in some way or other. Every time you suggest something to somebody else, be it telling your homeschooling children that they need to do something, or persuading a friend to go to the pub, you are selling. And conversely, nearly every second of your waking time, somebody is trying to sell you something. Even when you go online to buy something from Amazon, you're at the receiving end of carefully crafted marketing material and devious schemes to encourage you to choose a certain action. We're not just talking about Amazon here, but the suppliers and the sellers who use the platform. You may think you've made a freely given choice, but many people have worked hard to influence your behavior. A single misstep by them and all that effort is wasted, and you click on a competitor's product. So they're not going to leave that to chance. There's a lot of effort that goes into what you think is a casual interaction with a website. So at work, sometimes you're the buyer, and more often than you think, the seller. Every interaction with the customer is a chance to improve or tarnish the relationship with that customer. I know traditionally developers have taken the attitude, well, I shouldn't be involved in dealing with customers, or when you deal with customers, you haven't seen it as being your core job. So sometimes developers are perceived as being grumpy or not interested in the sale or being too truthful, all of these different things. So everybody has a chance to be on the front line. And even if you're not on the front line, you have the power to help or hinder. Within your organization, you may find yourself advocating a certain action. Well, that's selling as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to talk a little bit about sales work, so you can be better at pitching what you want to achieve and maybe recognizing some of the tricks that salespeople will try on you, evil Jedi mind tricks, as we like to, as people. So what I'd like to draw attention to at this point is, why is sales very much like dating and dieting? So you think, hang on, what's the possible similarities here? Well, it seems that the world has an appetite for sales advice in the same way it has with dieting and dating help. If there was some magic formula, then you would expect one book to rule them all. And there'd just be one book on Amazon about sales, rather than the 300,000 that you can see here. So that tells you there's a lot of people with a lot of different ideas about selling. So if there really was one magic formula, then you think that, like dieting or dating, there would just be one place, that one way people did things, and there'd be no room for any other things. So Basically, underneath all the novel twists, it's very much like dieting, that they'll all have some novel twist that advertises itself as being unique and different to everything else. Once all the novelty twists are removed, basically, dieting advice all comes down to maybe you should eat less and do more. And dating advice suggests that maybe you should appear attractive to your prospective partner. The core message of most sales training seems to come down to find out what the customer wants and do your best to persuade the customer you do a better job of providing this than the competition. So you'll notice I said better, not cheaper. More on this later. So effectively, all the 300,000 books will tell you some shape or form of just try and persuade the customer that you have got the better solution. So every sale starts somewhere, and they broadly fit into two categories. An inbound lead is when somebody goes to a customer and asks for something. An outbound lead is when a salesperson starts the process. In business to business, it's pretty clear cut, although the internet can blur that with advertising, offering such heavily targeted advertisements that can interrupt a user's day. So obviously Google AdWords now are so good that you can pretty much get in front of somebody when they're searching for something. So although technically speaking, it is an inbound lead when somebody clicks on the ad, you can target that so effectively that it's almost like an outbound ad. It's almost like an outbound activity because you're putting yourself right in the way of a prospective customer when they're looking for something. So let's talk about some examples of that. So everybody's heard the term cold calling. Cold is a measure of how close you are to an existing relationship with the customer. The colder it is, the more difficult it is. The more you know about the customer, the better you can target your approach. Generally, there are two approaches. Traditionally, there have been two approaches to how people go about outbound. So effectively, you can go for a swarm attack of large volumes of inexpensive communication. So basically, that's spam. By any other words, versus a more targeted approach. If your targeting is good enough, your customer might be receptive, but that takes time. So that's like crafting a very, very carefully produced advert where you have a product that does a particular thing and you try and advertise. So even though it is technically speaking an inbound lead because the customer's clicked on the ad, you've so carefully targeted it, it blurs the line. Cold calling used to be the mainstay of selling, and cold calling died when the pandemic came because suddenly how do you phone somebody in an office when everybody's working from home? So that pretty much killed cold calling, which is a good thing as far as everybody's concerned. It was an extremely ineffective way of generating new business, but people did it simply because they couldn't think of better ways. So there's been a switch in the way sales have worked. That the sales have become much more about being driven by the buyer. So customers are much better informed now. Obviously, the internet has transformed how informed customers are about things. There's so much material out there. The chances are somebody will do their own research and decide to call somebody. Now, you have things like tenders, which are somewhere in the middle, where a tender is somebody has advertised that they want something, and it's down to you to find those tenders. So that's kind of a weird position in the middle where you're effectively, it's not quite an inbound lead because you're going to make contact with the person who's tendered, but it's a marketplace where you're meeting in the middle. But generally, an inbound sale is where a customer has asked you for something, and sometimes it's much harder than you think. Just because somebody's asked you for something, it's not quite the gift you think it is. The customer may need 3 quotes, and yours is the one they don't intend to use. So basically, your quote fodder. So they ask you for a quote for something when they've already made a choice as to the supplier, and you're going to go to all that effort thinking that you've got a sale, and it's basically yours is the quote, which will be wide of the mark because you won't have all the information, and your quote will more or less go straight in the bin. But because of procurement rules, they're required to get 3 quotes. The customer may wildly understand your pricing structure or what you're selling, so there's just no way you can make a successful sale. The customer may simply think that you can do something for 5 grand when the reality is that it's going to cost you at least 20 grand, and there's nothing you can do to meet in the middle. You don't know where they are on the path to buying. You don't know whether they actually want something or they're just doing the equivalent of kicking tires. They may have come to you from a search engine, or they may have read your marketing material and be quite knowledgeable. You just don't know where they are. The hope is if they've reached out to you, they have a problem they think you can solve. So you've got something you can work with. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go all the way, but you've got something to start with. So let's just talk about the processes of a sale. So before we sell, we have to find people. Even an inbound lead starts with this, because you'll want to target a certain area, be it by SEO, be it for looking for certain tenders, be it by pay-per-click, all of these things. You have to target certain people. So even if you're relying on somebody coming to you, you have to have a certain amount of targeting. You have to think who you're actually trying to find. So I would say that is effectively mining for data. So people use LinkedIn, Sales Navigator for that purpose. All sorts of ways. You can buy lists, you can look on LinkedIn, trade shows, seminars. There are many ways of doing that. So you're trying to attract people's attention. So after that, hopefully you might mine and you get some people who are leads. And a lead is somebody you can make contact with, a potential problem you can solve. So it's an interesting one. In the old days, it used to be about visiting people in offices. It used to be about cold calling on the phone, or that was one of the main methods. But when everybody's working from home over the last 2 years, and it still predominates, it's much harder. And obviously we all get such a volume of spam email, then being noticed in the email is almost impossible. So if you're lucky, we go from that point of a lead then becomes an opportunity. Now, an opportunity is something where you find out a bit more about the problem they have. So you're trying to find out as much as you can about them. So what's the problem they have? How much is it costing them to have this problem? When do they need it? Who controls this? Are they the person who actually controls the budget on this? Or is there a committee? Are there technical requirements, budgets, supplier qualifications, etc.? So there's a whole load of things there where you start to find more. So it's not just somebody who could buy something, but you know, at an opportunity, when it becomes an opportunity, that you know they have a budget and they have some idea of when they want to do it. And then from there, hopefully you can move on to a sale. So you can provide a quotation. There may be several cycles of quotation, changes and specification, and then acceptance. And then it's a sale, woot woot. So obviously that makes it sound like it's a linear process and everything that starts on the left will end up on the right. And it's not the truth at all. So the reality is you can represent this as being something like a funnel. So obviously at each stage, it's kind of like the baby turtles crawling down the sea. For every turtle it hatches, most of them will get squashed or eaten by crabs, or so many other things that happen. Very few of them will even make it to the sea, let alone to grow up to be turtles that are big enough to come back. Now, the way things go into the sales funnel is much like the same way. So things start with stages. So there's a huge dropout at each stage. It depends on the industry and it depends on other things, what the rates are. But at each stage, the numbers will halve at the very least. So you have to accept failure when you're in sales, because you have to accept that you'll try and get large numbers at the top of the funnel, and they will gradually drop away. So that's kind of a weird concept if you've come from the background of being a developer where you only work on things that are going to be used. In sales, most of what you do just gets ignored or thrown away. Now, the problem is that even when things get through, there's a mismatch along the way, and so you've got a sale that even you've been successful in making the sale, it won't necessarily be commercially successful because you've sold the wrong thing to the wrong person. Kind of like the Russian tires we're talking about, where their missile vehicles are bogged down because somebody sold them cheap tires that didn't actually work in mud. So right at the start, we can try and do some things to optimize those. So in your mining process, you're trying to think about the problems your company can solve and who might have them. These problems can be general ones affecting all of us, or it might be quite specific to an industry or geography. So you need to think about who you actually want there. And then just because you've identified somebody as a lead, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful, because they may have already solved that problem. You have to reach out to them somehow, or they have to reach out to you, and you'd be noticed. So in any case, you need to get past the gatekeepers and speak to these people and find out what their problem is and see whether you can develop a little bit more by developing your message. To get to the opportunity stage, you need to find out much more details about the prospective customer that they might not want to share. So if you ask a customer their budget, chances are they'll say, no, we can't tell you the budget. So which makes it very, very hard to pitch a solution, because if somebody describes a problem and you ask them their budget, you don't know whether they're looking for a solution that might cost £10,000 or £1 million. Now you can solve the same problem at both of those levels, and if they won't tell you anything, you have to try and guess. The solution you're pitching is hopefully pitched to the budget they have, and it's a really hard skill. So, and the last stage before the opportunity becomes a sale, the customer has to commit. And when plans change, budgets are tight, and competitors are just as eager, that's not a given. Your baby turtle might be just at the edge of getting into the sea, and down swoops a seagull and gobbles it up. So even sometimes the thing you think is there at the last minute can success can fall away from you. So let's think about mining for a bit more. So we go to this huge effort. So sometimes it's overlooked that what you start with the right data is so important. If you pick the wrong data, so you go after the wrong people, even if you're successful in the other stages, your outcomes will be poor, because simply the inputs into the sales machine will be poor. A good salesperson could be good at working the process, but can't change the fundamental characteristics of the inputs to the process. That means if you're trying to sell a high value product and you're targeting customers in an industry where their budgets are very, very tight, even if you manage to sell something, the chances of you being successful are much, much less likely, are far harder, because you've just chosen the wrong data to start with. So coming to sales from the outside with the technical background, I was very aware that certain customers would be difficult. When our capabilities and the customer's expectations didn't align, the delivery part would be hard. So no matter how you did the delivery, it was just hard. Difficult means slower, and in the end the sale would be less profitable and the customer wouldn't be happy, and they wouldn't go on to be a good long-term customer. So sometimes winning the sale, if the conditions aren't right, means that the project itself overall might not be successful. But as a salesperson focused on targets, it's really, really hard. The temptation is just to sell it and solve the problems afterwards, even though you know in your heart of hearts underneath, these people might be a nightmare customer, or this thing is never going to work out well. So as a good example of that, anybody who's ever tried to build SharePoint into being a customer relationship management system will know what I like, know exactly what I mean. Sometimes customers say, oh, we bought SharePoint, so we expect it to be a great CRM system. What can you do to do that? So as a salesperson, you try and persuade them in another direction, but it might be they're determined to do that. So no matter what you can do, you're never going to get past that. So the problem is sales teams just don't see it in those matters. They're incentivized on the numbers, not the quality of the people they push through. So it's hard to measure the quality of the customers, and even if you did, you'd only know it after certain time has elapsed. So the problem is that sales teams will basically shovel in customers who may not necessarily be a good match in the end, because nobody wants to put their hand up and say, well, I think I'm going to pass on this sale because I think this customer might turn out to be a nightmare. So better data at the start should help the process, though, because by targeting the right people, hopefully you pick people who show all the indications of potentially being a better and more profitable customer at the end. So, and that works both ways. To all your data, you need to be thinking about who you're looking for to ensure that you're trying to target the right people. So it goes completely counter to the way most salespeople think, because most people in sales think it's a numbers game, get as many people as possible and the details will sort themselves out. Coming from a developer background, I was much more aware that choosing the right people and tuning these parts of it would make a difference to your success later down the time. So let's think about this a bit more. So the interesting thing people forget is that buyers, you need to think about what is your ideal customer. So you need to think about the sort of organization who can buy from you. The way they buy must match how they sell. You may be too expensive for a small company with a very small budget, or alternatively, really large organizations have very, very complicated procurement processes that only the hugest companies can deal with. And you have to navigate all those things. Public sector organizations tend to purchase in a far more complicated way than private ones. So you need to make sure that you're choosing the right organizations. This imposes some constraints on the places and the people you want to speak to. And then obviously over the last 2 years, COVID has ruined everything. So certain sectors just simply didn't buy anything for 2 years. And then when they've come back with a vengeance. I'm thinking particularly of the travel and tourism related industries. Basically, they were on life support for 18 months. And then suddenly things have picked up. And as we can see, they haven't got the capacity. So they've gone from feast to famine, but it means it's very, very difficult to solve their problems, because the first problem they had was survival and they weren't interested in buying anything. And now they've got the problem where suddenly they're ramping up, but they haven't got the staff to do that. And they're really far too busy to think about any new solutions at this point. They're just trying to hang on, which is ironic, really, because better solutions might actually help them cope with this surge in demand. But instead, they're just trying to hire more staff to do things rather than say, how can we use the staff we've got more efficiently? So a little bit of industry knowledge and business acumen can help here, because you will need to know what the situation is in the economy at large and think about that. And obviously what you're selling might be affected by regional or regulatory factors which make a sale harder or easier. So a general awareness of the business world is very, very handy there. I'm not going to dwell too long on the specifics. So there are many, many different ways to get your data, but LinkedIn Sales Navigator is widely used as a way of targeting the sort of organization you use. The search is sophisticated enough to narrow your search. It's worth pointing out that some organizations are completely invisible on LinkedIn, and sometimes the right people on LinkedIn are impossible to find. So LinkedIn is a useful tool, but it's not universally perfect because people choose not to be on LinkedIn. I find on LinkedIn, the more you're active on LinkedIn, the more spam you get from recruiters. And I'm sure IT buyers find that the more they're active on LinkedIn, the more you get people like me trying to get hold of them. So let's just think about this, that buyers are people too. Now, what happens is some salespeople tend to abstract away and they just think that you're selling a solution to a company. So a company might need something, but ultimately all organizations are collections of individuals, and each one of them is trying to do their job, but they're not always in alignment with each other or even with their organization. So an organization might buy things, but ultimately people within the organization actually buy things. As a salesperson, you need to work with people. And so there's this construct of a buyer persona, which is kind of like a semi-fictitious representation of a buyer. So you try and imagine what the buyer is like. Obviously, the more you do this, the better you can imagine what the buyer might be like. So given the size of the company and what information you can glean from LinkedIn, you might be able to understand what that buyer is and how they think, and make sure that you are able to answer the sort of questions they find out, and make sure you can pitch what you sell to try and match what their preferences are likely to be. Most of the time, any big sale involves lots of different people, and so you can't just construct a buyer persona for one person. You have to think about lots of people, so it gets quite difficult. But sometimes doing your research, industry knowledge and conversation with people, you can work out what motivations your buyers have, what objections they're likely to have, and what might make them say yes. It's also an interesting thought experiment to consider how these personas may look at your competition, because obviously you're in competition with somebody else. So if you think about these personas, you think, well, we know in this particular case we're probably going against these competitors, and you think, well, how would the buyers potentially perceive these competitors and what are their advantages to us? So you try and pitch yourself to try and emphasize the things where you've got a clear advantage. So if there's a gap in one of those things, maybe you can improve your offering in that area, or at least trying to emphasize your strengths might help cover your weaknesses versus somebody else. So now we talk about how sales has changed over the last few years. Originally, a few years ago, 10 years ago, everything was about outbound calling people, and the idea is that basically people who bought were just sitting there waiting for somebody to call them and sell them something that was clearly nonsense. So salespeople used to think that buyers would just be, a potential customer would just be sitting there waiting for their phone to ring. And if you phone them at the right time, you could set them off on their journey. Well, it's clearly nonsense. What happens is somebody decides they have a problem to solve, or they're told to solve a problem, and then they'll start to research the problem, and hopefully they will find you, or one way or another. And what you have to do is help them along their process. So instead of this horrible adage that people said of ABC, always be closing, you should actually be helping people along their way on their journey. So if you're too pushy with people, it sometimes results in pushback. So what you should just try and do is be somebody who assists them in their process, helps them, helps guide them. And sometimes it's okay to say that you can't help them and things like that, because sometimes that's actually quite rewarding, because they might commend you for your honesty if you say, no, we can't do that. It's still an idea that the world, buyers are clearly doing the buying themselves now, but not all salespeople agree with this. This was one of the things that, because I came into sales from outside, I was much more willing to grasp this, where 2 years ago, there were a lot of people in the period just before the pandemic, and they believed that, no, we don't care about buyers. We're just going to keep harassing people in the hope that they might suddenly start buying. So it's an interesting idea that's come along in the last couple of years, but not everybody in sales seems to agree with this. But regardless, some empathy with the person and trying to see the world from the buyer's point of view is a really useful skill. So we've talked about the last couple of years quite a few times. And I would just say it's an interesting thought that you shouldn't ever let a good crisis go to waste. So obviously over the last 2 years, we had this spike in people using the word unprecedented. Now we've got bored of saying unprecedented. It just seems that everything is precedented now. We've just got used to the fact everything's different. So there was a big reset over the last couple of years. It's been 2 years now, so we've pretty much forgotten about this, and this is we've accepted that this is the normality we live in, and that's how things are. So I've put on there the Chinese, now supposedly, those 2 brushstrokes represent what President Kennedy said, that there are 2 brushstrokes for the word crisis. One brushstroke stands for danger and the other one for opportunity. And that's actually quite a good expression of the last couple of years, that there's been a danger because everything that we knew before has been reset, but there's also an opportunity because there has been this reset. So again, I found this an interesting time to be going into this particular role, because I didn't know any better than how, and I was more prepared to challenge the accepted truths of how things worked. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit more about some of the dangers and the opportunities from the last couple of years and how they presented themselves. So the biggest problem everybody faced is that, how do you reach people when they aren't in the office ever? Show of hands here, who attends an office regularly still? So we've got 1. Okay. So based on that, and I would put my hand, oh, actually that's half and half now. That's quite interesting, because I did this about a year ago and I would have said it was about 10%. So now we're at, if I include myself, because I go into the office once or twice a week, I would say we're about 50-50. So obviously a year ago that was quite different, and at various times some of us hadn't been in the office for quite some time. But this has meant a huge difference in how you try to reach people, because the assumption was always that somebody was in the office waiting to be called. It's much harder to get hold of people now. Calling somebody's mobile, unless they've agreed for you to do that, is seen as much more intrusive. And most people don't necessarily, the phone has stopped being effective as a way of communicating with people, I think, in the sense of if somebody's consented to it, they may give you a mobile number. But it's a very, very different world before. Salespeople before would go straight onto the phone and try and talk to people, and that's dead. Quite frankly, that's a good thing as well, because I don't think cold calling is very effective. Everybody hates cold calling, and I just don't think it works. But it has been something that's challenged the way people have worked. There are plenty of companies out there that went into the first year of the pandemic desperately trying to call people and struggling to get hold of people, and wasting a lot of time phoning up offices, speaking to the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper would try and put you through to somebody's voicemail, and then if you tried to leave a message on a voicemail, might be your office number, but you're unlikely to ever bother picking that up. It's just an extremely ineffective way of trying to get hold of people. So the office meeting, RIP. Well, kind of. So in-person meetings disappeared in March 2020. So even when people came to the offices, they'd be very reluctant to invite strangers. And why would you? And the longer this goes on, the more ingrained this habit has become. So in an entire year between March 2020 and 21, I attended one in-person customer meeting. In contrast, in the world BC before COVID, I would have expected to attend multiple customer meetings in a week, and now I went that time. Now I'm going back to meeting people in person, but it's not by default anymore. So I don't miss the early starts, the late coming home, the arriving sweaty after standing on the Northern Line, but it's quite nice to be in a room together. As humans, we crave company. As salespeople, not to imply that salespeople aren't human, we relish the chance to read the room, look for the moods, the reactions, and just see what's going on and have the full 360 feedback, full 360 degree feedback of actually being there, because it's just not the same on video. Obviously now COVID restrictions are easing or pretty much gone. People are drifting back into the office and in-person is sort of back, but it's not the default anymore. The time when you would default to meeting somebody in person is gone. So you might meet somebody later on after effectively meeting somebody on video, and then after some months you might meet a customer in person. Some customers you might never meet in person, which is kind of weird. We've got used to that now. That's become our default. But if you were able to talk to yourself 3 years ago and say that actually most of my customers I'd never actually seen in the flesh, that sounds weird. I mean, some people have joined new companies and they've been there and they've never actually seen the other people they've worked with. So obviously, COVID accelerated the trend towards business doing business remotely, and everybody had to adapt to the same level as the early adopters who'd been doing this for years. And it's not that new. I remember doing a room-to-room transatlantic video call 20 years ago. But since that point, business air travel doubled. So even though the technology was there 20 years ago, plenty of people saw the need to fly across the Atlantic since then and go for it in business class, which is not a cheap thing. So it's obvious that people have still chosen to meet in person when they could, even when there are alternatives. But suddenly when there was no alternative, people were forced to try that now. So in-person meetings haven't gone away. They've come back as online meetings, but it's such a different medium. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about that. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. The obligatory Python reference there of the office meeting isn't dead, it's just resting. So let's talk about how things are to present on video. Now, yesterday I did a presentation to a customer on video. Tomorrow I've got a 2-hour demo of Microsoft Dynamics, which is going to be a tough one. It would be easy if you're in the room, you've got the chance to be a bit more entertaining and put a bit more vigor and energy into it. As it is, 2 hours on a video call with complete strangers is a really tough one. At first it was a very surreal experience when you wore a shirt and tie and slippers, and it sort of became normal. And I've noticed now that it's kind of come around now that people will dress quite casually in front of customers, because we've given up on the notion that you need to see a shirt and tie when you're doing a presentation. So even if you're in person, you might wear a suit, but if you're presenting on video, you just feel a bit foolish like that. So one of the things I've come to realize, in the same way that a shirt and tie were seen as being the obligatory badges of selling in person and projecting a professional image, nowadays it's down to things like camera and backgrounds and sound quality and steady internet connection. Now, it amazes me that people at a very senior level that are trying to encourage people to buy a lot of money will use a shitty camera that's on their laptop that effectively points up their nose, and they'll use the microphone that's on a laptop that is placed right next to the keyboard and the fan, so you'll get a terrible audio quality. So why not do as good as you can on video meetings? The problem is a video meeting, it's it's easy to set up a video meeting, and it's quite easy to get people to accept that. The problem is, compared to a formal meeting, you get so much less information from there, and sometimes just the cognitive burden of actually talking in a meeting like this means that you haven't got the time to observe how people are reacting. For example, I'm talking to all of you, cameras off. I don't know that any of you are still in the room. You put your hands up earlier, so I'm hoping that you are still there, but it's a very, very different feedback compared to when I've come to talk to you guys before, and we've been in Scott Logic, and I can see you all sprawled out on the sofas and things, and I still know you're there, and you can make a joke and you get some feedback. It's a very asymmetrical experience because a lot of the time people don't turn on video, so you have no idea what's going on. And talking to a blank screen when muted is really, really hard. The lack of feedback increases your cognitive load, as I said. And interestingly enough, I found that travel time, even though it was inconvenient sometimes, was also a chance for you to prepare for your next meeting and to mentally debrief yourself, especially if you're on the train. It was a fantastic opportunity to prepare and then to debrief yourself afterwards. Now, with video meetings, you can literally be back to back between two customers with 30 seconds, and that is really, really hard. So there's no time to, the appointments can pile up. There's no time to reflect or keep your notes in order. All these things meant that actually meeting people from home is far more tiring than a trip down on the train to London and a trip across town on the underground for an hour's worth of meeting compared to back-to-back meetings all day from home is actually far more tiring, I think. But the genie's out of the bottle at the moment, and meeting in person is gradually returning. It just doesn't seem to be the default. So this is what we have to live with now. So that's the world we find in. So that's it for me. I'd really be interested in some questions, and I'd love you to challenge me on some of those things. I've hoped I've provided some insight into the world of sales, and you may stop and ponder what you've learned as both a seller and a buyer, and hopefully be better at both. If you take nothing else away from this talk, it's just about perhaps have a think about how you can prepare better on a remote meeting, and just think about some of the ways that people perceive how you appear online. Sorry, I stumbled over my words after too many words there. So thank you all, and do feel free to find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I showed you that slide right at the back, which I will rewind back to if you're interested. So let me just find that. There we go. Thank you very much, everybody. And please feel free to harass me with some questions. And I would really welcome it if you challenged me and said, why would somebody who was a developer ever consider going to do something as horrible as being a salesperson?
Would you ever consider coming back?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know what? When I saw the code, I thought, oh, actually, that looks quite good. And I quite like the fact that when you code, you can concentrate on one thing all day. And I do miss that, the fact that, okay, so you have stand-up meetings and things, but generally developers might transition between projects, but fundamentally you work on one thing all day apart from when you're switching between projects. Whereas in my world, I have to do lots and lots of things at once, and that's a really, really high cognitive load. So there's times when I miss it, but not so much that I'd come back. And I quite enjoy interacting with customers, although sometimes after some days I was thinking, why me?
I found it quite interesting that you're actually analysing your own new role in a developer-minded fashion with like processes and the analytical nature of which you've just broken that down was fascinating, because it was just like a total developer approach to your own job.
Yeah,
just an observation.
So. Yeah, no, thank you. It's an interesting observation, actually, because I think I did bring a developer mindset to it rather than a classic sales isn't that analytic, and salespeople believe their own bullshit. That's the problem.
Yeah. You didn't mention like directly the marketing word in some of those slides, and although the direct sale, sort of outbound sale, has gone really cold, and yes, I'd agree with that. We see that in our own case. it perhaps means that the marketing role has become bigger in the sales process now. Is that something that you're seeing? And by marketing, I mean like the whole Google advertising, websites, the presence at trade shows. Is that now become more important now that you don't have the outbound calling?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that marketing inbound, because obviously marketing effectively brings you the inbound leads. I sort of mentioned that with mining. I suppose I wrote off the whole of marketing. I considered it to be mining. So your marketing managers probably be upset with me for just collapsing it down to something that simple. But effectively, your marketing effort is basically about mining data. So again, this is me applying a generalization to somebody else's job. But yeah, no, it's interesting. Marketing is all important because you need to bring the right people. So it's not just a matter of getting the numbers. You need to find people that are actually likely to be successful customers.
Yeah, totally. You can actually be a busy fool and not actually make any money if you're not careful with time wasting customers or non-profitable customers.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you bring in loads of people, but ultimately those people have got a budget of about $5,000 and you're trying to sell them a mobile app, you're onto a failure. There's just no, all is you're going to do is waste their time and make them angry because they think that they can get something for that much and you just can't do anything for that sort of money. So yeah, it is an interesting one with that. So salespeople traditionally think about maximizing numbers of everything and it's a funnel, but sometimes if you're digging for gold and you keep finding and you keep putting dirt into the process, then it's going to not be good further on. And I don't think a lot of sales.
You've got control over that width of that funnel, haven't you? You don't have to have one like this. You're ideally wanting one that's a bit narrower.
Oh, of course you can, yeah. But you have to be able to pick from loads of things. I find it's the same process. I do a lot of work with tenders, and tenders are. I could do a whole topic. I could do that as a whole topic because it's huge and fascinating, and it's a really weird mix of skills. But you're trying to see all of the possible tenders, but you have to rigorously qualify things out because some of those tenders you can't sell. You haven't got a product you can sell, and some of those tenders somebody else will be far better placed than you.
Which brings me back to the 50p switch on the helicopter, which just isn't a thing that exists when you come to military sales. The hurdles are so high. The amount of compliance issues around sales to the military are so great that you can just never afford to sell 50p switch for 50p. It'll end up being 100 quid.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the irony is the switch itself is 50p if you looked in an RS catalogue.
Yeah.
And literally you could replace one switch which just stayed switched with one that had spring loaded and it would have been the same price at procurement time, but because that whole wagon had been set off and it was unstoppable and it was certified and things, they had to do that. So they basically spent all this money in training to show people when you flick the switch, keep your finger on it and pull it back as soon as you're done with it rather than having a spring loaded switch.
I just feel there's an opportunity there for a retrofit elastic band around the switch.
Yeah, as long as it was bought, as long as it had a NATO service number.
And it had relevant compliance documentation.
Yeah, exactly. But, you think it's actually nuts, isn't it? Because some crew on a helicopter died because of that switch. So after that, they said, okay, we'll fix the problem with training to train people that when you switch that switch, keep your finger on it so you pull it back without thinking about it. It's just nuts, really. It's not quite as ridiculous as the Russian situation, but it just shows that a poor sale in the first place is hard to correct. And because projects are so big, you can't fix these things easily.
Yeah. Do you find that you are better at, because you've been on the developer side, are you better at understanding the sort of what we would call user stories in terms of sales? Does that sort of approach help you when you're trying to make sales?
Yeah, I think it is helpful because you can visualize how the project would be delivered, but you end up with a very, very strange situation where if you overthink the sale, you'll never sell anything because you'll look for all the problems. So sometimes you have to say, well, the developers are going to hate me, but I'm going to sell this anyway. Um, hopefully,
you truly have turned to the dark side.
I have turned to the dark side, but I would at least think, well, actually, it's a solvable problem. They will bitch about it, but it's a solvable problem rather than trying to sell something that's just physically impossible. You get a lot of that with things like Dynamics and SharePoint, where the platform makes certain things easy and things that the platform doesn't want to do are really, really hard.
Yeah, I think this is a real issue with people working on platforms. It's really, really difficult to assess the technical risk going into a project and to properly account for that in the hours in the quotation process, because something that can on paper look, you were talking about like flows and Power Automate and such like that. It all looks theoretically possible. You've got all the components, you've got the connectors, you've got the Lego pieces, as we think. Should be easy to click it all together, but then you actually find all the devil in the detail, and the simplest task can take you lose like 24 hours worth of developer time. I think that one's a really interesting one.
Yeah, and of course, low code is difficult to have the whole life cycle around that. So low code is made if somebody just jumps in there and hacks away at something, but you can't do that in a regulated environment. So to produce the whole application lifecycle management suddenly means your low code isn't actually all that simple anymore, because the effort is in all the pipelines and having that stuff. So actually understanding that stuff as a salesperson is quite useful. So I've got some idea of what's likely to be hard and what's likely to be not, and challenge a customer, because sometimes a customer says, well, I've seen a video on YouTube of somebody doing this. It's easy, right?
I was actually going to say that exact example I've come across. I've seen someone do this in 5 minutes. Why are you actually quoting 8 hours to do this?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
I've seen Power Automate low-code solutions described as the Excel macro
of
Office 365, where it's someone somewhere who got a little bit clever and then suddenly leaves. I mean, the only beauty of that with Office 365 is that it'll generally just break and stop working, as opposed to run for 15 years and then somebody discovers something.
Yeah, it's true though, because they're quite fragile, aren't they? That their flows will just suddenly, one of the connections will decide that it's stopped authenticating, so it'll just silently fail somewhere in the background.
Or even between tenants, you can get problems where it'll work on one site and not on another, even though the configurations are the same, just due to the tenants. There's some bizarre stuff going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah.
One of the issues I had with Logic apps, which is obviously the same engine under the hood, was we used to have to document where the single points of failure were because a connector was tied to a specific user. So on the team, it was because you need to interact with teams. Bodie, will you be quiet, please? If you interact with a Teams channel, you have to authenticate as a user.
Yeah.
Because somebody to interact with Teams needs a license, or you have to then develop a bot, which is a whole other barrier to entry that nobody really wants to do when you're trying to come up with a proof of concept or an MVP.
Yeah. One of the other interesting things I've found in platforms, and that's where a developer background is handy, is licensing, because essentially licensing somebody can watch the YouTube video and think, actually, we can do all this sort of stuff, but the licensing is odious.
It can kill it, totally.
Yeah, and a developer will just say, oh, we can do all those things and not care about the licensing. A salesperson will say, oh, we can do all those things and not care about licensing. But the solutions are so heavily dictated by licensing cost.
And Microsoft's habit of offering stuff for free and then going, but this is now a premium feature. You want to connect your SQL Gateway connector? Oh no, that's free for now. But
that would never happen.
Yeah, I find it amusing on Attended when you have to quote the license cost for 10 years and you're putting the same license cost today and from 10 years time, and you're thinking it's going to be different, but you don't know what it is, so you have to put a number down, and it's like, it's such a fiction. In a time of high inflation, can you really say that your Dynamics sales license that's £72.60 today will be the same in 10 years time? And it's like, I think not.
No.
Speaking of fiction, having seen both sides of it, what are your impressions of estimates now, and how do estimates feed into your sales process?
Estimates remain a source of misery for me. When I was a developer, estimates made me miserable, and when I'm a salesperson, estimates make me miserable for completely different reasons. So as a developer, I would think about the problem and I would say, okay, that's going to be 5 days. And it turns out when you actually did it, it's going to take 10 days because it's far more complicated for the reasons you can understand as a developer. So the project manager would crucify you for taking 10 days when you said it was going to take 5. So that's the world as developers as we saw it, that you're trying to estimate things where you don't know enough. As a salesperson, the problem is slightly different for me, because what's happened is I know that the customer has a certain budget in mind, and I've seen developers gold plate things, or you see, this is how far I've gone into the dark side, because I'll say, what do you mean 5 days for that? I think that's about 2 days, and the sale isn't going to bear 5 days for that particular thing. So in my head, I'm saying bloody developers gold plating things. So yeah, sometimes the developers, maybe they're honest or whatever, but sometimes you think developers are too cautious, so they tend to overestimate things. I can understand why, because they're criticized that, and that's difficult for a sale because you have a certain price and time frame in mind. The other thing that I find quite difficult is developers won't do an estimate unless they have really, really complete information. Because as a developer, you don't want to estimate on incomplete information. Well, in the world of sales, you are estimating for really large projects on completely incomplete information. Most ITTs have such scant information about the details, and you're having to estimate things where you're estimating 100K's worth of work, and you're thinking some of this is just fingers in the air type stuff. And that's hard, and because you can't get a developer to do an estimate on some things in a tender. They say there's not enough detail, I'm not going to give you an estimate. So okay, so I'll do an estimate instead. And I'm prepared to take that risk. I can live with much more uncertainty. So estimates remain a source of contention, especially the fact that developers won't estimate things without lots more information than salespeople will. So you can see both sides of the coin there. And I all of the things I just said as a salesperson there, you think as developers, oh my God, the horror, because he's just gone and sold something as 20 days when it's actually going to take us 40 days. If you'd have asked me, I'd have said 40 days, and actually we'll end up taking it in 60. And so, yeah, estimates are still difficult for different reasons.
Okay, thank you.
What's your take on sort of new software shops or startups, instead of going down the traditional market and PR sales route and going down a more advocacy route to rely on sales?
So could you flesh that out a bit more, please?
So, I mean, I've seen a massive rise in software shops doing more developer advocacy, where they're responsible for generating content and like user group session talks, conference talks, that sort of thing to drive sales. I think it's a bit of an ambiguous grey area on how you monetize that at all and then track that monetization, as opposed to traditional sales, or if you had a take on how that compares.
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually, because I have very much done that, and that was something that I brought to my employer that had never been tried before, because obviously I'm quite a prolific speaker, having been up to see you guys quite a few times, and I'll try and get around. Obviously I haven't done so much over the last 2 years, so I can see that works, but it is very, very hard to monetize. But I actually have an example where we won a significant customer on the back of me doing a talk, and I can actually show it all the way back. I can prove the chain of evidence, which obviously makes a much better case for me effectively spending marketing budget on me doing talks. So it does work. And we won a 100K order on the back of it. I did a talk dressed as an evil supervillain, in character as an evil supervillain, saying how I would use Microsoft 365 to take over the world, in character. And bizarrely, I was one of the people that attended my talk, passed my details on to a product manager, and the product manager reached out to me on LinkedIn, and on the basis of me being an evil supervillain, they were prepared to talk to me, and we won quite a large amount of work out of it. So it does work. I have evidence, but obviously that's only one time I can prove that's worked. I might have done it other times and it's worked, but I don't know that. So yeah, it's an interesting idea as a form of marketing, and it's fun.
Are you trying to tell us that one of your customers is an evil genius?
I'm not saying they are, but they were obviously attracted. They liked the cut of my jib when I was prepared to dress in a cravat and say, as an evil supervillain, these are the things I would do inside of SharePoint to make sure that James Bond didn't discover the plans for the Death Star or my underground base.
I'd call it sales charisma.
Yeah. So it does work. So I can demonstrate it now. Obviously there's a lot of advocacy that goes on, and I don't know whether other people can connect the dots in the same way. People must believe it's true because people are doing a lot of it.
For them to not find the documents, you just put them in SharePoint, right?
Yeah, well, it gave me the chance to talk about sensitivity labeling and a nice little demo. And unbeknownst to me, that it was streamed on Teams. And of course, as soon as you show a document that's got all the DLP stuff on it in Teams, it just shows as a blank box. That was quite funny. Because on my screen it was fine, but Teams did a really good job of stopping screen sharing. So you were literally sharing a black box, and there were people that were watching it online going, "I can't see anything," and I was like, maybe that's the idea. But yeah, Star Wars would have been very different if they just introduced a little bit of extra controls on documents. Make it a PDF and apply a sensitivity label to it, and Star Wars as a series would have only really been one film. So there we go. If the evil empire had used SharePoint, things would have turned out different. Any other questions? These have been really interesting questions, and I quite like the fact you're challenging me on all the horrible things I've done to developers as a consequence of my turning to the dark side.
No, I mean, I really enjoyed the talk. It's nice. It's changed to have something non-technical, and a lot of what you've said definitely is things I've seen or experienced. Mm-hmm. So yeah, very good talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I enjoy giving it. It would be much nicer to do it in person because it's just so much more interactive. But we just have to work with the medium.
And get the pizza after, obviously.
No, the thing is, no. I suppose you can go down and have your own pizza, and it's the pint afterwards doesn't feel the same. It's basically just like solo drinking, then, isn't it? But I find giving talks on video quite handy because it just means you feel at ease in the medium. And tomorrow I've got a presentation for a tender, and just that extra experience and polish it gives you comes across better in there because you'll be up against people that are much more wooden on the medium. And even if their product's better, you're going to present what you've got better, which helps.
You could have a better cape on then.
Possibly. I don't think the one tomorrow is going to involve a cape or a cravat, unfortunately, but maybe one day I will. So, I'll ask them if they have a hollowed out volcano. I mean, the even more funny thing is the company that I won as a consequence of that are based on an island in the Caribbean. So it is definitely full James Bond. So I can't say any more than that, but they have an office in an island in the Caribbean. I don't think it's a hollowed out volcano, though.
We all done for questions?
So when do you think you're going back to in person then? Have you get any closer on that one?
No, we're kind of looking for a venue and seeing, COVID permitting, when it is safe, but we'll be letting people know in good time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'd be really happy to come up and do a talk in person when you've got the venue sorted out.
Yeah, with real pizza.
real pizza rather than pretend pizza.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much for doing that, Dylan, and thank you for the earlier earlier talk from Peter. We'll wrap it up there. Next month we've got 2 speakers again. We've got Brett. Who's your speaker again? I've completely forgotten.
Marion Duncan Jones or Duncan Jones, depending on where you look.
Okay.
But he's doing a talk on event sourcing and CQRS in Azure.
Okay.
I've seen that session before, but the Glasgow Azure day that I attended in 2019, it will have been now.
Wow.
In the before times.
BC.
And we've also got Ted Young dialing in from the US. I think he's in California, so there's going to be quite a time difference there. So we're going to get him up nice and early to come and talk to us about hexagonal architectures. So that's one not to miss. Okay, well, thanks everyone, and we'll see you again next month, hopefully.
Thanks, then.
Okay, bye.
Thanks a lot.